All right, welcome back to episode 2 of chapter 17. We are in the home stretch. Getting back to this, as we're kind of like building up the challenges of the problems right now. And then we'll talk about some solutions and what's going on in regards to environmental justice. But we have to label this. We are in the 6th greatest extinction. And we are having species loss at a rate faster than we can even discover how many species we have. And that rate is increasing. That turtle has hundreds of millions of years of DNA, or a whale has hundreds of millions of years of DNA, and we are wiping that out in decades or less. The same is true when we look at a rainforest. People always say the rainforest could be a wetland, could be somewhere else where we find the next medicine or plant or knowledge that would be of great value to human beings in our survival, yet we're wiping them out before we are able to do so. We do not live here alone. Biodiversity is very, very important, and our biodiversity is taking a major, major hit. Most students now have heard of the Pacific or Atlantic Garbage Patch, the world's largest garbage dump, not on land, in the water. And these areas used to be 2 times plus the size of Texas. Now they are 3 to 4 times that. And how could that be? Out of sight, out of mind. If we think about our prisons, you really know a prison, like anything to do with the prison? No. They're in rural areas, they're hidden, they're up in Colorado, up in the mountains. Out of sight, out of mind. The same is true here. So other challenges to our oceans. Now, to me, population definitely seems like one of those pieces that's so critical because it's just going. And I have a link here to a population clock. You should look at the global population clock, show how many people die every how many seconds. But we have this sort of increase that keeps going unabated, right? So there are too many people. But we have to see that in the framework of history. And in the framework of history, it was, very, 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 very few people. And then all of a sudden, boom. And we know that as far as the Earth is old, we got here at 11:59 and 59 seconds. But now we're talking about just from John F. Kennedy's time, I think, to 25 or 30 years later, the population doubled from 3 billion to 6 billion. And now we're on to 7. So the amount of time that is happening is less and less and less. And this graph here, everything is connected to this graph. Resources, food, water, right? Like so many things connected to population. Now, Hans Rosling, who was my favorite person that did population studies, passed away a few years ago, but there's a lecture that I'll post a link to, which is really amazing, which at least gives us hope for peak population as we look at peak child and the ages that people are and what's going to happen in the future, but still very much connected to this. There's world population growth throughout history, same thing. All right. Let's talk about environmental justice. Environmental justice is a really important piece, and it resonates with me because there was a dry cell battery manufacturing plant in my hometown right on the river. And that's where most of them were. And it was poisoning that river for decades and decades and decades. And so we ask ourselves, where is the trash dump, the water treatment plant, the power plant? Is it in your neighborhood? Is it across the tracks in poor neighborhoods? What's that really mean? In Freeport, Illinois, it is actually literally across the tracks, across the river, in a side of town, the east side of town, which has been very poor white or predominantly African-American people of color ever since I was born and since Freeport's been around. From 1926 to 1989, Burgess Batteries, dry cell battery manufacturing plant, and left with environmental concerns ranging from underground storage tanks, cyanide plating, system residue, asbestos insulation, lead seeping into the ground, of course, the entire plant itself. They looked at remediating it, contaminated water, contaminated soil. 2 companies came in. They actually dug up the soil. That's how they remediate when they can't do anything else, and transport all that soil, usually to a poor area, usually to a rural area, usually to a community of color, and then had to have another company come in and do it before shutting down the site permanently. Now there's just a huge fence around that area. Likely you won't be able to use that spot for generations. So where are these? Because what comes downstream isn't equal, right? Those with the least amount of power get the most pollution. Okay, those who find themselves living to closest to the toxic output, especially of our industrial economy, are often the poor and disenfranchised in society. We know that these are people usually with minority status, and they get more of the environmental bads. So we find ourselves again talking about power and access, and what does that mean for us? And what's it mean particularly for communities of color? It means we have an unequal distribution of environmental goods and environmental bads. It means where you live and where you are born very much is related not only to your life expectancy and your health, but whether you will run into any of these environmental bads. And we find that usually well-to-do and well-connected people generally avoid the worst consequences of environmental problems. When we say there's a house on a hill in Colorado, that's a perfect example. It's literally up on a hill where it looks like you either have a helicopter pad or a very private road, or you don't leave your house very often to get to. But there are ways that when we have money and power and access, we can resist sort of the externalities of climate change. So we know that this is taking place. We know that communities of color, we know that impoverished places around the globe are receiving less justice, but we're aware that the poor are more at risk, get less justice. So sociologists, instead of just ignoring it, right, and being politicians and being like, I don't know, sociologists are like, how can we create change? How do we create more equality? And who do we need to listen to so that we can accomplish this? If you want to know what the experience of women, people who identify as a gender female, are like in this culture or other cultures, you need to listen. And we don't do that very well in this culture. If you want to know what the experience of is like for people of color, we need to listen. A lot of times it's just like talk, and I know this and I've already heard this. No, you need to be quiet and you need to listen, and that's where we'll learn something. So we need to go into communities of color. We need to go into communities where they're getting the low end or the short end of the stick as far as environmental justice, and we need to listen. And then we ask ourselves, how can we help those people? Because environmental sociologists and sociologists that are concerned with environmental issues, we provide, like other things, a voice for less powerful people, right? So that's what we do. We go in, we say, how can we create more equity? How can we create change? How can we help people? And then we listen to those people before we sort of, take our education and jump forward with that. Environmental justice wasn't even a big idea. I mean, there was some notion of it in the 60s, but it really emerged in the 1990s as a grassroots movement of just people in their communities concerned about the pollution in their neighborhoods, right? People in cities, people in rural areas, communities of color. And if we're looking at a 1992 study, it shows us that 3% of all whites and 11% of all minorities live within a mile of a hazardous waste facility. That doesn't seem like a lot, but it's a difference of a factor of nearly 4. Would people in dominant culture continue to just accept, with a difference of 4 times that, being that close to environmentally hazardous areas? So now it's a central civil rights issue in the United States. I think that it has its moments where it has administrations that support it. I think that over the last few years, we have seen more environmental protections just flat out dumped, rolled back, and trashed. And that is a dangerous, dangerous path to be moving forward on. During the Clinton administration, they signed Executive Order 12898, requiring all federal agencies to work towards environmental justice. But what the hell does that mean, right? That is open to interpretation. And certainly over the past few years, or 3.5, 4 years, this administration has worked in exactly the opposite direction. Don't talk to me about it like I'm being political. You can look at this, because what we'll do is we get voting records. If we want to know, and we'll talk about politics and the environment, who seems like it cares, because no, not every Democrat is a tree hugger, and not every Republican is out to destroy the environment. I mean, the Environmental Protection Act and agency was born during the Nixon administration, Republican-led, ideas coming forth, legislation coming forth. So it wasn't always like it is today, but we have to be realistic, and so we can measure exactly who voted for what, when, and how, and what that looks like. So did you know that MLK was working towards or for environmental justice? He was assassinated before he completed his goals across the board, but he was working with striking black garbage workers, and they were working for economic and environmental justice, right? Equal pay, better working conditions for these garbage workers, because it was extremely unequal, and of course continues to be. And Martin Luther King's Jr.'s legacy is not just in racial justice or the civil rights movement, it is with civil rights across the board, including environmental justice. All right, Oh, Jason, you talk about environmental bads. What are they? That would be hazardous and toxic waste, garbage, siting of hazardous industrial facilities. Oftentimes, these are local in their effect, so they reach communities that are least politically empowered, right? Whether that's class, socioeconomic class, heritage, nationality, rural location, but they do receive the bulk of the environmental bads. And we have to understand that with toxic waste, they have an impact not only where people live, but also where people work. And we know because Rocky Flats in Colorado is where they store a lot of nuclear waste, and they have had breach after breach after breach. That's up in the mountains. Then that has the ability to come down through the mountains, get into our waterways, et cetera, et cetera. Certainly pesticides in food production, we find that the cancer rates are 10 and 20 times that of dominant culture folks, of the folks who actually work around food production. Those cancer rates are through the roof because we are using pesticide as a way of farming, pesticide application, rather than sort of the knowledge that we have used in what farming and agriculture actually is. We also export hazardous jobs. People have little choice in other countries. They have very lax environmental laws. That's why it's like when we were doing an album, I was like, I want all recycled material back when you used to print up a CD and stuff. And I want the jacket to be recycled. And my buddy said, hey, do you know that that's better? And I said, of course it's recycled. And he said, yeah, but we're sending that to countries that don't have any environmental laws. And they're just kicking out that mercury. They're kicking out the bleach. They're kicking out all of those bad chemicals into the water in places where workers don't have as many rights, where the environment doesn't have as many rights. And that's saying something, knowing that the United States is really low on the list of prioritizing environmental concerns. All right. What do environmental goods look like? That would be a massive inequality in the distribution of wealth. And it's not minimal. It's an increasingly larger number. So the good things you get from the environment. And we know that this gap is increasing. And again, in a statistically measurable and important way, because the richest fifth of the world's people command 66 much time as the world's income as the poorest fifth. I mean, in 1960, so we've got 40, 50, 60 years ago, it was 30 times more. And this is where it was 10 years ago and 50 years. So we're doubling it. We're doubling our inequality. We're doubling the inequality gap. And that inequality doesn't just exist amongst global countries, it exists within countries themselves. As we see poverty rates increasing and those gaps between the rich and the poorest increasing as well. And where's Marx, right? Marx is like, how could you do that? How could that many people be receiving environmental bads and at risk and having their healthcare outcomes and the health outcomes of their own lives and their families' lives have such huge disparities when we know that that exists? So what are we going to do about it? Why have we failed to act? And why is that gap getting bigger? How do this many people continue to accept that sort of as just a thing that's got to happen? Marx doesn't know either. So again, I would suggest that things could never be perhaps equal, but do they need to be where my hands are no longer in the screen doing things that you can't even see? Or maybe they're still on the screen. Anyway, we have a consumption gap. The average person in rich countries consumes 3 times as much grain, fish, and freshwater, 6 times as much meat, 10 times as much energy and timber, 13 times as much iron and steel, 14 times much paper as the average resident in a developing country. We are a culture of consumption. We have a consumption gap. We have a pollution gap. And that's where we have to say, shouldn't countries that pollute more be more responsible for their pollution? We don't all really have the same externalities and results of it. So how can that be, right? The wealthy of the world create far more pollution per capita than do the poor. And how much more? In rich countries, per capita emissions of CO2 are 12 times higher than in poor countries, and that has increased since this statistic was put out 5 to 7 years ago. They're also more able, rich countries are, to sort of externalize the effects of their pollution, as well as like the export of toxic waste, dirty forms of manufacturing, hazardous jobs, right? Not in my backyard, not even in my country, but more and more and more other countries are not willing to take our hazardous waste. They are not willing to take our garbage. They are not willing to take on the burden of our pollution. So of course we look at inequality and the quality of life. What's it mean? It means a great deal, okay? People in wealthy countries live an average of almost 28, so let's say 27 years longer than those in poor countries. Most people I know, if I said, could I give you one more month to live, one more day to live, one more hour, you would take it, let alone 27 more years. So even within our country, right, differences in income have a substantial income on the quality of life, even in rich countries. And there's a huge disparity for people to acquire the most basic benefits: food, shelter, longevity, health. And then we use this to justify this, right, our economy that we've talked about previously as, well, we need some kind of inequality, and certainly it's justified. Poor folks don't try as hard, they're not as smart, they don't, blah, blah, blah. So we've already talked about all this. So my question would be, and maybe not, and maybe so, do we have a responsibility living in a wealthy country to make sure people in other parts of the world can acquire just the most basic of benefits or needs? Conspicuous consumption. We think of this idea of buying. I think of it now. You look in the 80s and early 90s, people were wearing ripped jeans too. But people come out of the gate and they buy pants that have like 50 holes in them. That is conspicuous consumption. Expensive homes, cars, just material visibility, right? And it shows how we kind of command that over nature. So what kind of items do you consume to increase your status? And I'm not putting this guilt on you. We know it's about responsibility. I consume. If I were to ask how many people here buy something to make themselves feel better, even though that sounds ridiculous, it's most of us, right? Conspicuous weight. How many waste? How many of you, and it's almost everybody, have roommates that they just ask, please, could you shut off the lights? Could you turn off the fans? How about the TV while we're gone? Not even while we're here. So excessive amounts of use of goods, discarding something rather than reusing it or repairing it. I mean, I have a 1954 tractor on the farm. It was made to be repaired. Whereas so many things today in 2020 are made to be replaced. That places a tremendous weight and strain on our natural world. Leaving food on your plate, running something like water all the time, buying the latest models. So anyway, our power over nature. And now we've got to think of some strategies, right, to work together towards a sustainable society. I mean, what does it mean to have an ecologically sustainable culture? I like this. A way of life that meets the needs of the present generation without threatening the environmental legacy of the future. How hard can that be? Take care of ourselves in the present. Everybody's all about that. And doing so, you take care of the future. All right? There's a lot of strategies. Bringing population growth under control, conserving our finite resources, reducing our waste, developing new energies, reconstructing the way we interact and value with our natural world. How we go about this short list, though, is really, really important. And there are a lot of ways. And when we do an assignment where I'm like, come up with a creative solution to water, come up with a creative solution to pollution, a creative solution to food shortages, we do it. We're creative, we're innovative, and we can do better than to wait for politicians and people who do not have the environment in mind necessarily to not act at all. So we are more creative, and we have shown that in the past in this culture, because this is the only culture I've lived in, the only country that I've lived in, but we have shown that, and I know we can do that. I mean, if dinosaurs dominated for 160 million years with tiny little walnut brains, we're only 250,000 years old humanity. So, I mean, what are the chances that we'll continue to flourish 160 million years from now? How about even 1,000 years from now? I mean, I'm rooting for us. We have thumbs, right? That's a big deal, right? So what do you think? What are the chances that human will continue to flourish 1,000 years from now? Yes, maybe, no way in hell. And now we come back to this. Are humans partially responsible for climate change, global warming? If you answered that before, no, you now know that there is a correct answer, and that is yes, without a doubt and absolutely. So to me, it doesn't really matter if humans are responsible or not. Like, that's just something to get us caught up again for another year, 6 months, 10 years, 20 years, while people push back us acting. If we had put the money into the levees in New Orleans, Katrina would have not been a disaster. Instead of $1 billion, you put up $50 million worth of levees. The differences in the price tag are amazing. When we look at investing, there is nothing in regards to the environment that you can invest in that won't make you money if you do it ahead of time. If you wait till the disaster happens, that's not going to be the case. So that is an appeal to even our most fiscally conservative friends and relatives. It's not about the price tag now. I mean, is there even a point to resisting the notion of global warming? I can't find it. We have one Earth. We know that. Who we assign blame to doesn't matter at all. We've just got to take care of her. I don't want to feminize or genderize the Earth. We need to take care of it, to be sure. So, Rocky Mountain Sustainable Living Organization. There are all sorts of fantastic organizations. We live in Colorado. We place a very high value on our natural world, and as we should. Look, this is just the last video. I don't know whether you're watching at the beginning of the semester or the end, but thank you for having a wonderful semester, for being good people, for doing good things, for watching these videos, or not, depending. But if you're watching this, then you are. So thank you, because I love sociology. I hope you've learned some amazing things this semester. Let's take it out on a big one. Every dance move I have all at once. Whoa, yeah, be good people and do good things. I know you are. I hope you contributed anything you could possibly contribute, even a box of mac and cheese to the food drive, so that we can make this world a better place. Because not just in regards to our environmental world or our natural world, but in regards to everything that we have studied this semester, I know that you're my students and you are young people, and you are the people that's it. Pass the torch. This is your job to make this world a better place, to do good things and be good people. Peace, everybody. Take care.